So again about the Carolingian Empire, and again about the relationship between imperial power and this time ecclesiastical developments of the Carolingian Church. Um, as it's known, the Carolingians made an extensive use in the building of their own empire of the ecclesiastical structures for with many aims. Really, the church was really engaged um, into various tasks in the imperial administration, for instance, but especially to maintain a social and at the same time political order within the empire. As if it was a glue, it had been a glue to keep the empire together, and also obviously of cultural promotion. And the extensive and intensive use that the Carolingians made of the church really had consequences on the middle and long term that paradoxically, especially from the age of Louis the Pious and of his successor, so such a great development in the engagement of the church into political affairs to sensibly reduce the same autonomy of the imperial power. This is a paradox, if you want. I mean, a parastatal structure probably has, especially Charles the Great had conceived the church to exist. That at a certain point limits also the same imperial power. Was it really, how it really happened in the end? Because what you see at a certain point into the Carolingian Empire is this, I don't know, this huge, enormous proliferation of new bishoprics and abbeys that were all tied in a broader frame, in a broader organizational frame that really had this increasing cultural prestige within the empire, especially from these very famous clergymen, that at the same time was protected by, militarily speaking, by the Carolingians and their own vassals. So you might argue what this was for, and we should make another videos to answer this question. Let's just say that arguably the reason why the church rose to such power, the clergy rose to such power in the Carolingian Empire, was the necessity of giving a sort of permanent centralized order to the empire. The Carolingian Empire had been born actually and had probably the roots of its success in the effort to create a larger public dominion over the multitude of Carolingian, or better Frankish, and when I say Frankish I mean also all the other national identities that existed in the Carolingian Empire, to all these Frankish aristocracies that had proliferated during the decadence of the Merovingian kingdom or empire, in that indeed were a force against which the Carolingians had to struggle, but at the same time also a force that the same Carolingians used in order to expand their power. And the great problem at this point was that, and it was something that was done even against the let's say the ecclesiastical aristocracy. It's something that sounds strange, but de facto this was really what was happening in many areas of the Merovingian Empire before the rise of the Carolingians. Because basically churchmen like bishops or abbots had, especially bishops, had rose to a huge power into Frankish Europe, and that they had basically substituted themselves to the public authority when the Merovingian Empire had collapsed. So much of the actual resources broadly meant, and you call them of financing, that made the Carolingians rise as a military power within the same Frankish Empire was due thanks to the fact that Charles Martel, seemingly starting from him, began to to confiscate all the lands that these ecclesiastical noblemen had basically usurped during the centuries of vacancy of a strong centralized authority. But at the same time, whether this was done against and at the same time through the same aristocracy, what the Carolingians saw is that they couldn't entrust the power, the political power of what they were building, which was enormous, especially from the perspective of the European early Middle Ages, to a social system that basically didn't conceive public authority from any point of view. I mean, theoretically speaking, the Merovingian kings had created a public authority, but just in the sense that they were the stronger dynasty over the Frankish entity that therefore had a monopolium of all the power in the kingdom, but it wasn't much perceived as a public thing from a statal point of view like it could be in the Roman Empire, and as you will find, for instance, in partly in Visigothic Spain and definitely in Longobard Italy, in fact by Roman influence. In the Frankish world, even the royal authority was still seen in the old Germanic personal fashion, that basically told that the kingdom was of the Merovingians because those had conquered it with their swords, and therefore it belonged to them by right. Even obviously the Merovingians took really a lot to strengthen even ideologically this idea, but paradoxically they returned to ashes for the very same reason, for the same reason that there wasn't permanent subtle structure that, in spite of the of the generations passing and the Merovingians splitting their properties among the brothers when the father king died, could hold and support and sustain the dominions that they had created, in the 6th century. And what I find extremely fascinating about the Carolingians in this from this point of view is that instead they had a great mind. They theoretically speaking, the Carolingians emerged from I can't say really the easternmost, but definitely they were Austrasian. I mean, they came from a region that had retained still a very strong Germanic um, Germanic cultural identity, and yet they were those who, when they managed to kick out all the other um, um, what we call them were the majordomi of the Frankish Empire, that were these ministers that really ruled in the place of the now declining and vanishing Merovingian dynasty. They managed to conquer. I mean, they had the power, they had the military strength, a military strength that was definitely fueled by clienteles that worked through personal bonds of loyalty, and that were really similar, if not the same, in any other in other Germanic context. But yet, and therefore they were very into that mindset, and yet they were the ones that probably managing all those power and understanding, having risen from the bottom to the top of the Frankish world, how it really worked. They decided that it couldn't, the Carolingian Empire couldn't be built simply over these old mindset of personal ties of loyalty and so on, because they knew that eventually those would have vanished, and the Carolingians therefore had put such a huge effort in the building of something that could last more, that they saw that in the church, because the church, and a reformed church, not the old Merovingian church of noblemen who basically had nothing ecclesiastical but the name and rights, but into a sort of parastatal entity, that probably they observed elsewhere in Europe. Surely the Carolingians at that point had pretty clear how the church was, for instance, in the Byzantine world. In the Byzantine world, that was obviously this imitation model that the Carolingians took for even for their own empire in some ways, at least in order to be able to be in the condition of comparing with it and competing with it. Probably so that the church was something that could be used as a solid block to structure their state and to make hopefully the empire surviving. Then we all know how things have gone. The Carolingian Empire collapsed, it vanished, for many reasons. One could argue, though, if the excessive development of the church in the Carolingian Empire was one of the factors. I don't know. I don't have really an answer to this. Maybe you can offer me an insight about it. To me, probably the church was one of the most important. The Church Reformation, in the fashion the Carolingians managed to achieve it, was one of the most important legacies that eventually survived the Carolingian Empire. Not just from a cultural point of view, but also from a political point of view, which I don't mean that it was really a success, because ultimately speaking, as we will be seeing now, when we talk about that church, we're still largely talking also about the same Carolingian families that retained that old Germanic personal values of loyalty and of doing and participating to politics from an ecclesiastical point of view, position to aid your originary family and so on. What I'm saying is just that European history was very, very marked by what the Carolingians had done in the church, and with the church, because all the great monasteries, the great bishoprics that you think about it, and the relationship that they had eventually, even in the low and late Middle Ages, with the kings and princes and other earthly powers, were really in part, I can't say set at the times of the Carolingian Empire, but definitely the relationship was started in that fashion for a base area of, especially of Western and especially Central Europe, from that point of view. And we can argue that eventually it expanded through the expansion of feudalism during especially the low Middle Ages, well, also into the peripheral areas of the continent. And let's say that this ecclesiastical presence, first of all, we have to understand it from the very core, because it wasn't something that you could really escape in a world like that. Meaning that the ecclesiastical apparatus was really robust. It was very strong. It was growing and hinged and based on very stable seats, that we're talking obviously about the dioceses and the metropolitic seats, and we don't have to never to forget into this in parallel from the dioceses and metropolitic seats were together with parishes were at lower stratum were the standard hierarchical asset that the Catholic Church had since the time of Constantine, and it was the pattern through which it expanded essentially, and especially in ex-Roman Europe and all over. The urban phenomenon had a strong development. This for the simple reason that since the late empire, the dioceses had always developed into the cities. Sometimes the Romans, while the aristocracies were declining in the late Roman Empire, and I'm talking about the emperors really here, relied sometimes even more on the bishops for administrating that city and the pertaining territory than, in fact, of other figures. So this had remained, for instance, in Frankish Gaul, especially. In Frankish Gaul it was very strong indeed, but also in Visigothic Spain. So they were out there always as a standard pattern, but you never have to forget about the monasteries. Monasteries had a huge spiritual and intellectual power. They really worked hard, and the monasteries were really on the rise. I mean, the dioceses were something very old that had always existed there. Maybe the major changes being the shifts in that city's power or that bishop's power in economical or political terms. But monasteries at this time were really expanding fast, and they were very strongly endowed by the Carolingian dynasty and excuse me, the aristocracies that were part of the Carolingian like hierarchies, and also for the simple fact that Christianity was on the rise in many lands that were formerly pagan. So it was very important also in this process of evangelization that went sometimes in parallel with the Carolingian conquests to found new monasteries and to make them not just purely isolated place where monks had to pray for the salvation of the empire and Christianity, but as something much more political and in this very territorially rooted, which meant that also monasteries began to become extremely powerful, extremely wealthy, with soldiers, with retinues, and all this, as we know, was done in parallel with the same aristocracies that had founded those monasteries in a very complex and indeed very interesting synergy in building very very strong territorial dominions, at least on a local scale, um, and um, and therefore um, and you have to think that all of these religious centers produced a lot of um, highly skilled, highly cultured men who entered the Carolingian court. So you could see the Carolingian court full of clergymen, of monks, of people, of abbots especially, who had compared to the like people a much greater education on average, and at the same time a very good understanding of how to rule, because these were advisors and counselors of the same Carolingian emperors, and they were at the same time part of that aristocracy that fought and ruled for the empire. So there were extremely well taught and extremely intelligent people who really knew how to use mm, their intellectual as well as spiritual weapons. And at the same time, in comparison, if you look instead at the hierarchy of public officials, the thing was really different. As we know, the Carolingians, especially Charles the Great, tried to create, probably inspired by what was in use in practice in the Longobard Kingdom, a net of public officials, of like officials that could in this sense, obviously comfort and help the local administration. But at the same time, even in the so-called missi dominici, so these envoys sent by the lords and by the emperor, firstly were usually one ecclesiastic and alike. So in this sense you see that the ecclesiastical presence was always there, and probably was a much better one, because these missi dominici coming from a like background, I don't know how reliable that they actually were. Even the same Carolingian counts were sometimes sent in diplomatic missions, but just think what it meant to rule a place or to administer justice without knowing how to write. The Carolingian counts were ignorant like goats, and they couldn't. There was only one thing they did extremely well, and they did better than everyone else at that time in Western Europe: to fight. But you can't just fight. You need you need a structure, an administrative structure, to keep well organized what you conquered, and these counts weren't able to. So probably one of the major causes that eventually made the Carolingian Empire collapse, and this partly explains the question that I posed before, whether the ecclesiastical development in Carolingian Empire was a factor to the deterioration of the same solidity of the Carolingian Empire. I think not, because after all, the Carolingian Empire collapsed largely for wars that were fought largely among the military class, like one. And even if obviously abbots and bishops had to bring their men to war, there was still a sharp difference in terms of what the ambitions of a count that was the one that eventually was in charge, at least of political and military affairs. I mean, they were the ones who really started these wars. Also, because very importantly, the bishops didn't split their own goods, their own dominions at every generation. The bishop died, and another bishop came, and maybe they weren't even related. These counts and military men were instead very much into something different. They wanted to expand for continuing their dynasty, and even if obviously part of their own children went on to become bishops or abbots, and they could wage war. The rules that really regulated their evolution into the political their participation in political matters were really different. And I believe that if the Carolingian Empire had probably given the ecclesiastical powers even more importance, and had probably tried to emphasize the solidity that ecclesiastical structure could offer, maybe I can't say it could have lasted more, but at least there could be more unity at a local level in some measure, which is, however, largely a speculation, because you see that really these guys were the same people, like our ecclesiastic, they came from the same families. So at this point, it's just speculation. But what I'm saying is that the hierarchical the hierarchy of public officials was very weak and unstable compared to the ecclesiastical one. And when you look at these clienteles that made up the Carolingian armies and personal retinues, you only see that the only thing that was keeping these military men faithful to their lord was just this traditional bond of clientele loyalty and fealty that wasn't, however, very manageable on the long run. Also, because there was a periodic need of getting rid by the Carolingians of the most powerful guys. I mean, if you obviously you can understand that it was really a great prestige, and these are the dynamics that I was talking about before when criticizing the likes in the political affairs and in their capability of giving a stable order and frame to the political unity of the Carolingian Empire, is that the Carolingians had risen to power basically thanks to these military clienteles that they were the ones they had gifted with um, with lands that were really what the Carolingians changed in absolute terms. I mean, creating this very strong professional military elite by giving them the lands and therefore the resources for equipping and training and becoming something that in Europe we had never seen up to that point, that is a feudal society. Um, um, but these guys obviously, would follow the Carolingian emperors and kings into their campaigns. They would fight year after year, because that's really how it happened. And there would be a sort of you know of trial in this. I mean, looking who was the toughest, the most powerful, but at the same time the best ones would become through this way extremely powerful. So even when they became too powerful, uh, maybe the Carolingians would like to make rise someone else to counterbalance that powerful count, and that count would resent because he had fought all of his life just to reach that position by swearing loyalty to the emperor. And then the emperor would try to let him go in a way, and to substitute him with a new, younger, especially bolder count that maybe was poorer. Let's remember that many men that the Carolingians named counts were not even aristocrats at that point. Were just men rising from ranks, and therefore there would you see in this sense that there was such a great rivalry and antagonism and competition within these political client and military and political clienteles that really hurted the political unity of the empire. There was even something cyclical into this antagonism, because, and you can see that very well, for instance, during the life of Charles the Great. That was indeed a very long life, especially as a king for those times standards. Many of the counts that fought alongside Charles when he was young wouldn't survive when he was middle-aged or an old man and still and was still in charge. Both for ethnographical reasons, but also because obviously they went to war, and they might have died in that. So you could see very well at Charlemagne court this renovation, updating of the comital power, that however caused very intense rivalries and a great competition, especially in a world in an empire that was growing extremely large. These weren't just a few counts, these were really a freaking lot of people. And what was worse, from this point of view, is that first of all you couldn't control them well, or even if you could do that, the only way was to give them land, and giving them land you were automatically assuming that they would try to keep it, in spite the land belonged to the king, and theoretically in Carolingian times the land would have had theoretically to come back to the hands of the sovereign once that he even wished, without even waiting that the count to which he had given land would die. So it was a system that was really destined to crumble in many ways. And let's say that the Germanic personal idea of power won over the statal Romano-ecclesiastical model of empire. But that was obvious, because after all it was these counts that had the upper hand in military affairs. In this sense, you find that obviously there were rivalries even within the same imperial power, with all the various sons having different ambitions and trying to court, in this sense, the best the best counts to fight and to make them belong, taking part in their retinue, and therefore it was a system that you couldn't handle with the normal, Frankish tradition of let's say of division of the lands and of other elements attached to that, and all the consequences. And I think it's very important at this point that you see appearing at court bishops and abbots, and the royal court, and starting, being more trusted by the Carolingians as advisors and counselors, because they might have been powerful and and still related to those counts, but it still belonged to to a different kind of organization. And if anything, it was much easier to first of all, they didn't pass their dioceses or monasteries to their sons usually. The Carolingian emperors and kings had much easier time to substitute an abbot or a bishop than doing it with with a count that had only his military retinue somewhere, very far away. Um, at this point, the figure of the king became a meeting point, of various ecclesiastical influences that, in a certain sense, definitely enriched the same Carolingian court, and that on the long run probably made for this exact reason, the bond between the Carolingians and the church so strong, because on average they were better than the counts, and they were probably also much more reliable in many ways. And you see at the same time that these bishops and abbots were really happy about that, not just because obviously they lived at court and they had an influence on the various emperors and kings, but also because they sought to gain much more protection for their possessions than it was normal. Meaning, they couldn't pass their dioceses or abbeys down to their sons, but they could make it possible that the imperial power would defend their properties. They would enrich them, and especially defend them, really even militarily, from the lay powers, because the real point is also this, that this sort of protection, the idea of the inalienability of church rights, was really built at this point. It was still present, but the Carolingians reinforced it, by sanctioning the fact that ecclesiastical properties had to be protected, nobody could touch them, and this was very important, even in post-Carolingian Europe, because indeed, through this way, if an abbey or could boast, a charter written by Louis the Pius back in the day, even if it was 1 century after, or even 2 or 3, they could say, wow, this is something that the emperor himself and granted us. So we are ultra safe. And from this you understand, I mean, from a juridical point of view, that that was really I don't know, maybe in Carolingian times how that was evident, but I think that the roots, the seeds of this, of the development of ecclesiastical um, lordships, really starting to being felt and planned at that point, and it did has its roots thanks to the relationship with the Carolingian court, royal court, really from this point. However, let's not make it too, sharply differentiated. Always remember that the same clergymen during the conflicts that even torn apart the Carolingian Empire were maybe siding with that king, or pushing for his political agenda, and therefore they were still involved into this fragmentation of the political power that at the same time was still one of the causes of the end of the Carolingians, which is pretty evident. But I think differences remained, especially because the church was really being structured in a different way from lay properties. Maybe not in practice, but definitely by right and ideological perspective in a different way. And this is what was evident at a certain point during the Middle Ages, in which of course the Pope then strengthened its power on these entities, and even provided them with other rights in order to win them over the the various national local identities, that political entities that they may be supported, and all those very complicated political games that took place in low medieval history of the church. So I think I've not gone too far at this point. Probably said a bunch of things that can definitely be debated, and I would love you to to debate them with me. I would like to know your opinion about it. If you enjoyed this video, share it. That's the best thing you can do for me. Otherwise, leave a like or just comment if you're curious about something. Write me an email, and as always, remember you that if you want me to answer a question of yours through a video, this is a very good moment, because I have a very few requests and I can find the time to satisfy them. And I wish you a great time. If you if you heard my video, if you listened to my video until this point, thanks, and see you next time.